There is an old saying, what do you do with a mech sim engine when you don't mech sim at the current moment? The answer is, you Interstate 76 it. It's a very particular saying that only applies in one single instance, that of Interstate 76, a game made by Activision way back in the year 1997. A game that existed apparently just because one of the developers of MechWarrior 2 wanted to buy a muscle car from the 70s, and everybody got around and said, you know what, that's what we're gonna do with the next game. We're gonna make a car game that's like a mech game, but with cars. And when you think about it, they would fit. They're both simulators at their core, only unlike MechWarrior, this simulates something that is tangible, something that can be calculated, or at least approximated, from reality, whereas with a mech game, those things would not be able to stand upright, let alone walk, since they'd be pretty much knee-deep in earth after a single step. But with a car, oh, that's so much simpler, isn't it? Or is it? Because here's the main difference between a mech and a car. A mech will travel at a certain speed, sometimes stopping, going backwards, rotating, waiting to ambush enemies. A car, however, needs to move quite quickly, constantly, and thankfully, the engine was already built to house giant environments with not really all that much detail in it, because it was still the age of the early 3D games, when you couldn't really fill everything with the amount of detail you wanted and still have a game that can be considered a simulation. Computers weren't that powerful. If you only wanted to show things and not actually use the terrain, yeah, you could up the detail, add some trees, add some vegetation maybe, and you'd have yourself the basis for a flight game, for a dogfighting game. Those tended to look quite nice even back then, but you couldn't really drive on that road you would see from the plane, because it was a road, though sometimes you could land on it. Oh, here you could interact with the environment. You could jump off bridges, you can even tear some of them down, and you can blow up any car that's around you, even the ones you're not supposed to. Technologically, Interstate 76 was not an easy job to achieve, because it required a lot of rebuilding of the MechWarrior 2 engine, since it was in an age before engines were really made to support different games. They were made to support one game, and mostly through patchwork and hodgepodge together elements. It was more in the sense of the game was keeping the engine upright, supporting it as a roof would support a bunch of walls. So that's why you may see MechWarrior 2 not working spectacularly well these days on some machine, and Interstate 76 as well. The footage in the background is a bit of a combination between the demo version that I found on the web, it ran horribly, and the GOG version I got from GOG. It too runs kind of badly, but I found a fix for it that limits the frame rate at 30, because I couldn't get it to do it with the frame rate control from Radeon software, because that thing never works. And you kind of need it to run at 30 because the physics are tied into the frame rate, and if it goes, let's say, over 60, it goes 75, well, you're in for something that's really not all that awesome, especially in terms of how wheels behave and how the AI works. And since this is a game about cars and AI, you will not have a nice time without that fix. The fix, however, does crash the game after each mission, so there's that. Thankfully, you do have time to save. Now, what exactly is this game about? Well, it's a game about revenge. Your sister got killed. She was a vigilante, tearing down the highways and freeways of the United States in the 70s, dealing justice from a car. Actually, I don't think there were highways back then, there was just the interstate. Actually, is that a highway? I don't know anymore. After she gets killed, it's your job as the fantastically named Groove champion to deal out justice, alongside Taurus, vigilante by day, poet by night, badass non-stop. And you do this through a succession of linear missions. Though linear is, well, they're linear in the same sense that most games of this type, of this age, had linear missions. You would have a giant map that you could pretty much do everything you would want to do on. You could run around in every direction you could, as long as the game didn't have a fail condition. If, for example, you got too far from one of your charges, from your wards, from your companions, from the thing you're supposed to protect. It's in the same vein as, well, most dogfighting sims, most aircraft games, Wing Commander even. It's in the same kind of framework. Not as advanced as Terra Nova, Strike Force, Centauri in terms of how the missions are created, how they're built, but it is still quite nice to see the level of freedom that you still have in this game compared to, well, something that you'd find in most games today. If you want, you can think of this as a more simulator-oriented version with cars of Crimson Skies, because they are basically kind of the same type of game. But whereas Crimson Skies drenched itself in the allure, the romanticism of old Hollywood without the racism, this one drenches itself in the sleekness, the groove of the 70s without the racism. Man, things sure improve when you remove racism from them, don't they? But anywho, in terms of setting a mood, a style, especially a style, Interstate 76 had it made. It had it in spades. Yeah, I know, we are 1 year away from Half-Life. But look at the scale of this game. Look at how complicated the cars are. Well, they're not complicated actually. They're quite simplistic by today's standards, but for then, for the sheer space, for the sheer freedom it gave you, and again, for the simulation aspect, it looked about as good as they could get it and still be able to run it on most systems. And one sacrifice in that aspect was that they had to make the characters look kind of but instead of going, oh yeah, we're gonna make them look fantastic, photorealistic in the cinematics, no, they just went with making them look like they were from 1992 everywhere. And that absolutely gave it an even more fantastic style. You won't confuse this for anything other than Interstate. If you see a single frame of a cinematic, you may confuse it for that Dire Straits song, Money for Nothing video that was made by the people that made the reboot, the excellent TV series that had better CGI than this, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Actually, I'm just going on a tangent. The point was, it's a game that looked good, it's a game that sounded good, and it's a game that played, well, how exactly it played depends very much on how you feel about Mech Warrior. If your single contact with the Mech Warrior franchise is Mech Warrior Online, it's a fine game on its own, but it is more arcade than its predecessors. It is a streamlined experience. The same goes if your main contact with the vehicular combat genre is some of the new stuff that's come out in the past couple of years, like that crossout thing that kind of thought was going to be good, but instead was just World of Tanks with cars that you built yourself. If that's your point of inspiration, then this may be a bit of a unexpected hike in complexity. This was a game made back when you would need an entire keyboard to actually play these things, or better yet, a joystick. A joystick with a hat switch so you could look around left and right. And not just because it's cool to look left and right, but because you can point your arm out a window and shoot your gun at the enemy. You also have a lot of dials and knobs to watch out for and see where they are. You have also a bunch of camera settings that you also need to keep an eye on, because who knows, maybe you want to snap onto the target, maybe you want to snap onto your missile, maybe you want to snap down to a bird's eye view and see exactly what's happening and just run around in a circle and make fire everywhere because you have a weapon that can do that. What I'm getting at is that any game that has more than 3 buttons for target management is a sim. It is something that tries to simulate something and will probably require you to have an extra control method other than a keyboard or a mouse. You can also use the mouse, but it really doesn't do much in this game. It's a car game. And if you're thinking that you can play it with a gamepad properly, well, yeah, you can use a gamepad. Just remember that in 1997, the dual sticks weren't really the norm, and you may run into some issues from time to time. And progressive triggers weren't a thing either for acceleration and braking, but we did have throttles that you could stick at a certain level because that's how joysticks worked and still do. It's a fiddly game. There's no beating around the bush. It's that kind of fiddly game that makes you actually want to fiddle with it. It can be aggravating at first until you figure out what all the controls are, why you're constantly exploding, why pressing backward doesn't actually throw you into reverse, why everybody's wheels are looking like they're gonna come off any second. But once you have it all figured out and get accustomed to the old way of mission structures that didn't allow you to save during the missions because screw you in your free time, you'll find that this is kind of a nice game. It was vehicular combat at its finest in the 90s. It's a lot more involved vehicular combat with actual weapons that you have to target and aim, unlike Carmageddon where you just ran into people and sometimes use some pickups as weapons. Yeah, it's not pretty to look at right now, but it does also come with a deathmatch component that's either just for you and the AI or for playing it online, I think. Not sure if it still works online, didn't really test that component. But most of all, there's the campaign itself, the missions where you play as Groove and battle around tourists across the southwest somewhere in the United States in the 70s, dealing justice one bullet at a time and scavenging parts from fallen enemies so you could beef up your ride and become the smoothest Mac daddy of them all. I kinda miss this genre of games, honestly. I think we're probably gonna mention in the second edition of the podcast of gaming trends that have gone away, but this used to be a game genre. Actually, no, not a genre, because a genre would also define some core mechanics. Maybe a game meta genre, a game framework, if you will, like a succession of missions that you have freedom within, with large areas that you can explore and fight enemies and complete objectives, and you would get scavenge from your fallen foes and use them to upgrade your machine and maybe even get money and get a better machine. It's something that you would find mostly in, I guess, RPGs nowadays or strategy games like Battletech, but not in action games, not in Sims. Well, not until September 2019 when MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries will be out. But that's something tied to MechWarrior. It's intrinsic to its existence, but in other games, in the car games, that's not a thing anymore. And space games, that's not a thing anymore. Well, maybe it will be with Star Citizen with the Squadron 42. But there's no more Strike Commander. There's no more Interstate. We need this genre, this framework to come back. And if it comes back with another Interstate game, that would be amazing. Because, you know, it's Interstate. A game that wasn't really all that super successful, had a sequel that was kind of there around about, and there was a PlayStation offshoot of it called Vigilante 8, but I somehow believe that Twisted Metal sort of got in front of it and pulled the brakes, and well, I don't think it ended well for Vigilante 8. If you're interested in playing Interstate 76, you can find it on GOG right now for a little bit over €5. If you're gonna get Interstate 82 as well, you can get them both in a single pack that costs around €8 and a bit. You also get the expansions for all of them, the Nitro packs and all the other things. I kinda wish I had better footage to show you on the background for this show, but I spent a lot of time just trying to make the demo work properly and realized that, I actually couldn't, so I just bought the game later, and maybe I should just bought it from the get-go, but I kept seeing that the game has problems, even the GOG version, and it does, but they are manageable up to a point. They can work. What I kind of sad to see it didn't work was fiddling with Radeon software to get anti-aliasing in and all the other stuff. It's kind of sad because I used to use Radeon software to get MechWarrior 3 to look amazing on my Athlon 64 with all the anti-aliasing turned up and all the good stuff. Well, yes, there's Zoe's ZNB mods. Probably. I'm not exactly sure if it uses OpenGL or Glide or whatever, but it's probably moddable. Probably somebody out there made a graphics mod for it or something. I'm sure they have. Goodbye, everybody.
To the fun, eye-bounding, trans unstoppable to you, my dear.